The night I stopped trusting my own eyes was the night I realized a mansion can hide more secrets than an empty house. Daniel Brooks never imagined those words would become the truest thing he had ever believed. To everyone else, his life looked untouchable. Financial magazines praised his business empire. Social media admired the elegant home overlooking the lake. Friends joked that he had won the lottery of life by marrying Claire Bennett, the beautiful woman who somehow managed to make every room feel warmer the moment she entered it. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, and strangers smiled whenever they saw them together, convinced they were looking at the perfect American family. Daniel used to believe that too, until one quiet Wednesday evening changed everything. At exactly 7:42, the front door opened without a sound. Claire stepped onto the porch wearing a simple cream-colored maternity dress instead of the designer outfits hanging in her closet. One hand rested gently on her growing belly while the other carried an old canvas tote bag Daniel had never seen before. She paused for a brief moment beneath the porch light, looking toward the darkening sky as though silently gathering courage before walking down the driveway. Daniel frowned. Something felt different. Claire always told him where she was going, especially now that the pregnancy had entered its final weeks. She disliked walking alone after sunset and usually insisted that he drive her anywhere farther than a few blocks. Tonight, she did neither. She walked past 3 luxury vehicles sitting in the driveway, without even glancing at them, and continued toward the corner of the street. Seconds later, an aging yellow taxi stopped beside her. She climbed inside, smiled politely at the driver, and disappeared into the evening traffic. Daniel remained frozen behind the living room window. His business instincts had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars by teaching him to notice tiny details other people ignored. Tonight, every instinct told him something important had just happened. He looked at the family calendar hanging beside the kitchen. No appointments. No doctor's visit. No dinner plans. No explanation. For nearly a minute, he argued with himself. Following his wife felt wrong. Distrust had never existed between them. Claire had stood beside him through years of impossible schedules, exhausting business trips, and endless public appearances without once giving him a reason to question her. Yet the image of that unfamiliar tote bag and the quiet determination in her eyes refused to leave his mind. Finally, he grabbed his car keys. Keeping several vehicles between them, Daniel followed the taxi across the city. Familiar streets gradually gave way to neighborhoods he had not visited in years. The polished storefronts disappeared. Towering office buildings became modest apartment complexes. Bright restaurant signs faded into quiet blocks lined with aging brick buildings, family-owned laundromats, and small grocery stores preparing to close for the night. Claire had no friends here. No family. No business meetings. At least none that Daniel knew about. 25 minutes later, the taxi slowed beside an older building tucked between a neighborhood church and a small community garden. Claire stepped out carefully, thanked the driver, adjusted the strap of the worn canvas bag, and walked toward a simple side entrance illuminated by a single porch light. There were no luxury cars, no expensive restaurants, no private clinics, no elegant charity gala. Just a modest building where a volunteer warmly opened the door before greeting Claire with a hug that looked far too familiar to be accidental. Daniel parked across the street without taking his eyes off the entrance. Through one of the softly lit windows, he caught a brief glimpse of Claire smiling at someone inside. A smile so genuine and effortless that it looked completely different from the polished expression she wore at public events. Then the door quietly closed behind her. Alone inside his vehicle, surrounded by the silence of a neighborhood he did not recognize, Daniel suddenly realized he had discovered something far more unsettling than a lie. He had discovered an entire part of his wife's life that existed without him. Daniel stayed inside his SUV long after Claire disappeared through the door. The dashboard clock quietly changed from 7:58 to 8:10, yet he could not bring himself to leave. The building looked ordinary in every possible way. A faded brick exterior, a small wheelchair ramp, warm yellow lights glowing behind simple curtains. Nothing about it belonged in Claire's carefully organized world. He watched people arrive one after another. A young mother carrying a sleeping toddler. An elderly man balancing 2 grocery bags. A teenage volunteer unloading boxes from an old pickup truck. Nobody drove expensive cars. Nobody wore designer clothes. Yet every person who entered smiled, as though they had finally reached a place where they could breathe. Daniel lowered his window slightly. Cool evening air drifted into the vehicle, carrying faint laughter from somewhere inside the building. It was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet kind of laughter shared by people who felt safe. His phone buzzed on the center console. Claire had sent a message. "I hope your meeting is going well. Please do not work too late. The baby has been kicking all evening. I cannot wait for you to feel it when you get home. Love you." Daniel stared at the screen without replying. She believed he was across town meeting investors because that was exactly what he had told her that morning. The meeting had been canceled unexpectedly, bringing him home hours earlier than planned. If that had not happened, he would never have known she came here. He placed the phone face down and looked back toward the entrance. Minutes later, the front door opened again. Claire stepped outside carrying an empty canvas tote instead of the full one she had brought with her. Before she reached the sidewalk, a little girl, no older than 6, hurried after her wearing a pink sweater several sizes too large. The child wrapped her arms around Claire as carefully as she could around the pregnancy. Claire smiled with unmistakable affection, knelt slowly despite her growing belly, and gently brushed a strand of hair away from the little girl's face. Daniel could not hear every word, but one sentence reached him clearly across the quiet street. "Good night, Mom Claire. Will you come back next Wednesday?" Time seemed to stop. Daniel instinctively leaned forward in his seat. "Mom Claire." The words echoed inside his mind with unsettling force. Claire kissed the child's forehead with quiet tenderness before answering. "I promise. I always keep my Wednesday promises." The little girl smiled with complete trust before running back inside. Claire watched until the door closed, then raised her hand to call another taxi. Daniel remained frozen. Hundreds of questions raced through his mind, each one more confusing than the last. Had Claire known this child before their marriage? Why had she never mentioned her? Was this simply a nickname, or did it mean something much deeper? Every answer he imagined seemed impossible. Keeping a careful distance once again, Daniel followed the taxi home. The ride felt much longer than the trip there. Claire arrived first, quietly unlocked the front door, and disappeared inside. Daniel waited another 5 minutes before pulling into the driveway, hoping she would never realize he had been behind her the entire evening. When he entered the house, the comforting aroma of homemade vegetable soup filled the kitchen. Claire looked up from the dining table with the same gentle smile she always wore whenever he returned from work. "You made it home," she said warmly. "I was beginning to think the meeting might run late." Daniel forced himself to smile back, searching her face for any sign that she was hiding something. Instead, he saw only kindness, quiet exhaustion, and the peaceful anticipation of becoming a mother. As they sat down for dinner together beneath the soft kitchen lights, Daniel realized the greatest mystery was no longer where Claire had gone that evening. It was how the woman sitting across from him could still feel so familiar while suddenly seeming like someone he had never truly known. That night, Daniel lay awake long after Claire had fallen asleep beside him. Moonlight spilled softly across the bedroom, illuminating the nursery door they had painted together only a month before. Everything around him reflected the life they had carefully built, yet his thoughts remained trapped inside that modest building across town and the little girl's voice calling his wife Mom Claire. Every explanation he imagined seemed to collapse beneath its own weight. Claire had never given him a reason to doubt her honesty. She remembered birthdays, volunteered at company events, called his mother every Sunday, and somehow found a way to make every house they owned feel like a real home instead of another expensive property. None of that matched the suspicion quietly growing inside his mind. The following morning, Claire was already in the kitchen making breakfast before Daniel came downstairs. She smiled as she placed a plate in front of him and laughed when the baby kicked hard enough to make her pause in the middle of a sentence. Everything about her felt completely normal. She asked about his upcoming meetings, reminded him about their prenatal appointment on Friday, and gently teased him for drinking too much coffee. If she carried a secret, she carried it with remarkable peace. Daniel found himself studying every expression on her face, wondering how many Wednesdays had passed exactly like this without him noticing anything unusual. Later that afternoon, after Claire left for a prenatal yoga class, Daniel walked through the quiet house, searching for nothing in particular. He stopped near the front hallway where the faded canvas tote rested neatly on a small wooden bench. It looked harmless, almost ordinary, yet it had become the center of every unanswered question in his mind. He stood there for several moments, struggling with his conscience. Invading Claire's privacy felt wrong, but pretending nothing had changed felt impossible. Slowly, he unzipped the bag just enough to see inside. There were several children's storybooks with worn covers, neatly folded baby blankets, crayons, coloring books, and small packages of diapers. Everything appeared well-used rather than newly purchased. Tucked into one side pocket was a sealed envelope with Claire's name written neatly across the front in blue ink. Daniel hesitated before carefully unfolding the letter inside. The handwriting was uneven, as though written by someone still recovering from difficult days. Dear Claire, thank you for staying when everyone else was too busy. Because of you, my daughter laughs again. She believes tomorrow will be better because every Wednesday, you keep your promise to come back. I can never repay what your kindness has given our little family, but I hope your own child grows up knowing his mother changed more lives than she will ever count. Daniel lowered the letter slowly, reading it again from the beginning. There was no romance, no hidden confession, no secret relationship, only gratitude so sincere that it left an ache in his chest. He carefully placed the letter back into its envelope exactly as he had found it, returning every item to its original place before closing the zipper. At that very moment, he heard the garage door opening. Claire was home earlier than expected. Daniel stepped away from the tote just as the front door unlocked. Claire entered carrying a small bouquet of fresh white daisies, smiling the moment she saw him. I found these at the farmer's market, she said happily. They reminded me of spring. Daniel smiled back, but this time the guilt belonged entirely to him. He had spent 2 days searching for evidence that his wife was hiding something to hurt him. Instead, every clue seemed to reveal a woman whose quiet compassion reached far beyond anything he had ever understood. Even so, one question refused to disappear. If everything she was doing was filled with kindness, why had she chosen to keep that part of her life hidden from the person who loved her most? The next Wednesday arrived with an uneasy calm that followed Daniel through every meeting and every phone call. Numbers filled the conference room screens, executives debated investment strategies, and multi-million-dollar decisions waited for his approval, yet his attention drifted back to the quiet building across town. Shortly before sunset, he left the office without telling anyone where he was going. This time he did not wait at home. Instead, he parked half a block away from the neighborhood where he had followed Claire the week before. At exactly 7:43, the familiar yellow taxi stopped in front of the building. Claire stepped out carrying the same faded canvas tote, smiling as she thanked the driver before walking toward the entrance. Daniel waited several moments before following on foot. As he crossed the street, he noticed details he had completely overlooked before. Fresh flowers grew in small wooden planters beside the front steps. Children's colorful handprints decorated one of the windows. A modest wooden sign near the entrance simply read Grace Harbor Family Center. There were no donor plaques, no advertisements, and no grand entrance announcing generous benefactors. The place seemed to exist only for the people who needed it. Before Daniel could decide whether to leave, the front door opened. An elderly woman with silver hair smiled warmly. "Good evening," she said. "Are you here to volunteer?" Daniel hesitated before answering honestly. "I wanted to learn more about this place." "Then come inside," she replied without hesitation. "There is always room for one more kind visitor." Daniel quietly followed her through a hallway painted with bright murals created by children. The scent of fresh soup drifted from a nearby kitchen, while soft piano music played somewhere deeper inside the building. Families sat together around long tables sharing dinner. Volunteers laughed as they carried trays from one room to another. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt artificial. It felt like a home that happened to welcome everyone. As they reached the end of the hallway, Daniel stopped beside an open doorway. Claire sat on a colorful rug surrounded by several children, a well-worn storybook resting in her hands. She changed her voice for every character, making the children laugh so hard that even the volunteers smiled while passing by. Sophie leaned comfortably against Claire's shoulder, completely absorbed in the story. Every few moments, Claire gently rested one hand against her own pregnant belly before turning another page. Daniel had watched his wife deliver speeches before hundreds of business leaders without showing the slightest trace of nervousness. Yet he had never seen her look as completely herself as she did in that simple room filled with children. There were no photographers, no elegant evening gowns, no applause, only genuine joy shared without expecting anything in return. Daniel remained hidden in the hallway, unwilling to interrupt the moment. Two volunteers stopped nearby carrying boxes of donated books. One of them quietly smiled toward Claire. "I still cannot believe she has not missed a single Wednesday in almost 3 years," she whispered. The other nodded. "Not even during snowstorms. She always says promises matter most when keeping them becomes inconvenient." Daniel felt his heart tighten. 3 years. That was long before Claire became pregnant. Long before they started planning a nursery or choosing baby names. He looked back into the room where Claire was helping Sophie sound out difficult words on the page. It was obvious the children trusted her completely. As Daniel quietly stepped farther into the hallway, the center director approached from the opposite end carrying several folders. He noticed Daniel watching the reading circle and offered a friendly smile. "You must know Claire," he said. Daniel slowly nodded. Before he could answer, the director added a sentence that made every unanswered question suddenly feel even larger. "Then perhaps you are one of the few people who already knows why she first walked through our doors 3 years ago." Daniel's expression remained perfectly still, but inside his mind every assumption collapsed at once. The center director's question lingered in the quiet hallway. "Then perhaps you are one of the few people who already knows why she first walked through our doors 3 years ago." Daniel slowly shook his head. "I am afraid I do not know as much as I thought I did." Before the director could respond, Claire's laughter drifted from the reading room. She had just finished another story, and the children surrounded her with handmade drawings and excited conversations. Sophie proudly held up a picture of a small white house with flowers lining the front walkway. Claire smiled warmly. "That is beautiful, Sophie. Tell me about it." The little girl pointed to 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. "That is you. That is me. And one day that is your baby coming to visit us." Claire's eyes filled with quiet affection. "I think he would like that very much." Daniel watched from the hallway, overwhelmed by a version of his wife he had never known. She was not performing kindness for a fundraiser or posing for photographs beside oversized donation checks. She belonged here in the simplest possible way. The children trusted her because she had earned that trust one Wednesday at a time. As the activity ended, the children scattered toward the dining room, while Claire carefully gathered crayons and books into the familiar canvas tote. She turned toward the hallway, and the moment her eyes met Daniel's, she stopped walking. Surprise crossed her face first, followed almost immediately by understanding. She did not look angry. She looked disappointed that the secret she had guarded so carefully had finally reached him this way. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The hallway grew unusually quiet as nearby volunteers politely found reasons to step into other rooms. Claire walked toward Daniel at an unhurried pace until only a few feet separated them. "You followed me again," she said softly. Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Yes." She studied his face without raising her voice. "How much have you seen?" Daniel took a slow breath. "Enough to know I was wrong about almost everything." Claire remained silent. Daniel continued quietly. "I saw the children. I saw Sophie. I read the letter that someone left for you." A flicker of surprise crossed Claire's face, but it quickly gave way to calm acceptance. "I wish you had asked me," she whispered. "So do I," Daniel admitted. "But I was afraid of the answer." Claire gently rested one hand against her baby bump before looking toward the room where Sophie was laughing with the other children. "And now," Daniel answered honestly, "now I am afraid that I never truly knew the most extraordinary part of the woman I married." Claire looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening. "Come outside with me." They stepped onto the front porch where the evening breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers from the small community garden next door. The street was peaceful, illuminated by warm streetlights instead of the bright glow of downtown skyscrapers. Claire leaned lightly against the wooden railing and looked toward the quiet neighborhood before speaking. "There is something I should have told you years ago," she said. "But I needed to become certain that I was doing it for the right reasons before I shared it with anyone." Daniel listened without interrupting. Claire slowly turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything began because of one frightened little girl who asked me a question that I could never forget, and the answer I gave her changed my life forever." Claire rested both hands gently over her growing belly before looking back toward the softly lit windows of Grace Harbor Family Center. Children's laughter drifted through the evening air, blending with the distant sound of wind moving through the nearby trees. She smiled quietly before speaking again. 3 years ago, I was visiting the children's wing at a local hospital after one of our foundation events. Everyone else had already left. I stayed behind because one little girl was sitting alone in the hallway holding a stuffed rabbit. Daniel listened without saying a word. That little girl was Sophie, Claire continued. She looked at me and asked if people stopped remembering mothers after they were gone. Claire paused as though she could still hear the question exactly as it had been asked. I told her that love does not disappear just because someone cannot be seen anymore. Then she asked me if I would come back the following Wednesday. Claire let out a slow breath. I said yes. I thought it would be one visit. She glanced toward the doorway where Sophie was helping another child gather coloring books. One Wednesday became another. Then another. Eventually, the hospital connected me with this center after Sophie moved here, and I simply kept my promise. Daniel felt a quiet ache settle in his chest. Why did you never tell me? Claire looked at him with gentle honesty. Because every place I went with you, people introduced me as your wife before they introduced me as Claire. They thanked me for donations that came from your company. They assumed every good thing I did was possible because of your success. She smiled faintly. None of that was your fault. You never asked for it. But after a while I realized I wanted one place where people knew my heart before they knew my last name. Daniel lowered his eyes. Claire continued softly. Here, I am not the millionaire's wife. I am simply Claire. I read stories. I remember birthdays. I bring diapers when someone needs them. I sit beside frightened mothers until they stop feeling alone. That is enough. Silence settled comfortably between them for several moments. Daniel realized he had spent years believing generosity was measured by annual reports, charitable galas, and public recognition. Claire had quietly measured it one promise at a time. The letter I found, Daniel said carefully. The woman thanked you for giving her daughter hope. Claire nodded. There are many letters. I keep them because on difficult days they remind me why I started. Daniel looked toward the center once more. Have you been paying for all of this yourself? Claire hesitated before answering. Only the things I could afford. Before Daniel could ask another question, the center director stepped outside carrying a slim folder. He approached them with a warm smile that quickly softened into something more thoughtful. Claire, he said gently, I hope you will forgive me for interrupting. She looked at him curiously. Of course. He turned toward Daniel and held out the folder. There is something you deserve to know. She would never tell you herself. Claire immediately shook her head. Please do not. The director smiled kindly. You have protected this secret long enough. Daniel accepted the folder without opening it. The director continued quietly. Grace Harbor nearly closed twice over the past 3 years. Both times we survived because of Claire. She never wanted anyone outside this building to know how much she sacrificed. Daniel slowly looked down at the folder in his hands, sensing that the answers waiting inside would change the way he saw not only his wife, but everything he had ever believed about what it truly meant to be rich. I have continued the story while maintaining the established timeline, characters, setting, and emotional continuity. SUA, Daniel held the folder with both hands, but did not open it immediately. Somehow the thin stack of papers felt heavier than every contract he had signed throughout his career. Claire looked at him quietly, almost pleading with her eyes. You do not have to read it, she said softly. None of this was ever meant to become important. Daniel looked at her with gentle disbelief. If it matters to you, then it has always been important. Slowly, he opened the folder. The first pages contained donation records stretching back nearly 3 years. Month after month, every contribution carried the same simple name. Claire Bennett. There was no mention of Brooks Enterprises, no corporate foundation, no publicity campaign, only small, consistent gifts that covered groceries, children's clothing, school supplies, medical transportation, emergency rent assistance, and counseling services. The amounts varied, but the commitment never disappeared. Daniel turned another page, then another. His eyes stopped on a receipt from nearly 2 years earlier. The description was unmistakable. Antique sapphire bracelet. He recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Claire's grandmother and had been one of the few family heirlooms she treasured above everything else. He remembered asking once where she had stored it after they moved into the new house. She had smiled and simply said it was somewhere safe. Daniel slowly looked up. You sold it. Claire lowered her eyes before answering. A young mother here was about to lose her apartment in the middle of winter. She had nowhere else to go with her little boy. The bracelet could sit inside a box for another 50 years, or it could become a warm home for someone who needed one immediately. The choice did not feel difficult. Daniel felt every word settle deeply inside him. The center director quietly continued. That was only the beginning. During another difficult year, Claire quietly covered several months of utility bills when donations unexpectedly stopped. She always asked us not to tell anyone, especially you. Daniel frowned with confusion. Why keep it from me? I would have helped without hesitation. Claire stepped closer, her voice calm and sincere. I know you would have. That is exactly why I never asked. I needed to know whether I was willing to sacrifice something that truly belonged to me instead of giving away what was already easy to replace. I wanted my kindness to cost me something, because that is how I knew it came from love instead of convenience. Daniel could not find an answer. Every success he had celebrated suddenly seemed measured against a standard he had never considered before. He had spent years believing generosity was defined by how much someone gave. Claire had quietly taught herself that generosity was defined by what someone was willing to give up. Just then, the front door opened, and Sophie walked outside holding a folded sheet of bright construction paper covered with colorful stars and tiny handprints. She smiled shyly before walking over to Daniel. Miss Claire said grown-ups like surprises too, she said as she handed him the paper. Daniel carefully unfolded it. Across the front, written in uneven crayon letters, were the words, "Thank you for sharing Claire with us." Inside, dozens of children's signatures surrounded a simple drawing of Claire sitting beneath a tree reading a book while smiling children gathered around her. Daniel looked at the picture for several silent seconds. It was worth more to him than every framed business award hanging in his office. He gently folded the drawing and placed it inside his jacket pocket. Then he looked at Claire with quiet admiration. "I thought I built a successful life," he whispered. "Tonight, I finally realized you have been building something far greater, and I cannot spend another day standing outside it." That evening, Daniel drove home beside Claire in complete silence. Yet for the first time in years, the silence felt full instead of empty. The city lights reflected across the windshield while Claire rested one hand gently over her growing belly and the other inside Daniel's. Neither of them felt the need to explain what had already become clear. By the time they reached home, Daniel had made a decision that would quietly reshape far more than his own future. The following morning, he arrived at Brooks Enterprises before sunrise. His executive assistant expected another day filled with investor meetings, acquisition calls, and board presentations. Instead, Daniel canceled every appointment for the next several days. Architects, nonprofit consultants, community planners, and accessibility specialists were invited into the conference room one after another. When they asked whose name would headline the new project, Daniel answered the same way every time. "The building is not about me. If my name appears anywhere, I have misunderstood the entire purpose." Weeks passed as plans slowly became reality. Rather than purchasing an expensive downtown property, Daniel acquired an aging brick building directly across the street from Grace Harbor Family Center. He insisted that every design decision begin with one question. What would make life easier for a struggling parent walking through these doors? Wide hallways replaced narrow corridors so parents could move strollers comfortably. Bright classrooms welcomed children after school. Quiet counseling rooms offered privacy. A teaching kitchen allowed families to prepare healthy meals together. A small library filled one corner with shelves of children's books waiting for new readers. Claire knew nothing about the project. Daniel wanted her to experience it without expectation, just as he had experienced the hidden world she had quietly built over 3 remarkable years. Nearly 4 months later, after another encouraging prenatal appointment, Daniel invited Claire to lunch. Instead of driving toward their favorite restaurant, he turned into the familiar neighborhood surrounding Grace Harbor. Claire looked at him curiously before recognizing the newly renovated building across the street. Construction fences had disappeared. Fresh landscaping surrounded the entrance. Young maple trees lined the walkway, and colorful flowers framed a welcoming front porch. "Daniel," she whispered with surprise, "what is this?" Before he could answer, the center director stepped outside carrying a simple brass key attached to a blue ribbon. Smiling warmly, he placed it into Claire's hands. "We have been waiting for you." Claire looked from the key to Daniel, completely speechless. Daniel nodded toward the front entrance. Go ahead. With trembling fingers, Claire unlocked the door and slowly stepped inside. Warm sunlight poured through large windows, filling the building with soft natural light. Comfortable family rooms, childcare spaces, counseling offices, classrooms, and a welcoming kitchen stretched before her. Volunteers from Grace Harbor quietly applauded as several young mothers smiled through grateful tears. Everything had been designed for dignity rather than luxury. Claire turned slowly, unable to find words. Daniel walked beside her and spoke gently. I spent years believing success meant building companies. Then I discovered that the strongest foundation I had ever seen was built one Wednesday at a time by the woman I love. Tears filled Claire's eyes as she embraced him. You did not have to do this, she whispered. Daniel smiled softly. No, I wanted to. As they stepped back outside together, Claire finally noticed the wooden sign standing beside the entrance. There was no company logo, no mention of Brooks Enterprises, no recognition of a wealthy donor. Carved into the wood were only 4 simple words. Claire House. Beneath them, in smaller letters, another sentence quietly completed the promise that had begun years earlier. A place where every family is seen. Claire looked at Daniel through grateful tears while he gently rested his hand over hers. At that moment, both of them understood that the greatest legacy was never measured by the fortune someone leaves behind, but by the doors they open for people they may never even meet. 6 months later, the first warm Saturday of spring settled gently over the neighborhood surrounding Grace Harbor Family Center and Claire House. Cherry trees lined the sidewalks with pale blossoms drifting through the morning breeze while families gathered in the courtyard for a community picnic. Children laughed as they chased colorful bubbles across the grass. Volunteers prepared homemade meals in the outdoor kitchen, and neighbors greeted one another as though they had known each other for years. Claire stood near the entrance holding a baby boy peacefully asleep against her shoulder. They had named him Ethan Brooks, and every time he smiled in his sleep, Claire insisted he looked exactly like Daniel. Daniel stood beside them carrying a small basket of children's books instead of a briefcase, something that had quietly become his new Saturday tradition. Sophie spotted them almost immediately and raced across the courtyard with joyful excitement before stopping carefully in front of Claire. She looked at the baby with wide eyes and whispered, "Is this the little boy you kept telling me about?" Claire nodded with a warm smile. "This is Ethan." Sophie reached out one finger, letting the baby gently wrap his tiny hand around it. Her face lit up with wonder. "Hello, Ethan. I have been waiting to meet you." Daniel watched the moment in silence, realizing that several months earlier he would never have imagined standing here, feeling completely at home. Every Wednesday evening, he now left the office before sunset without exception. Sometimes he helped children finish homework. Other weeks, he repaired bicycles, organized food deliveries, or simply listened to parents who needed someone willing to hear their stories. Nobody called him a millionaire. To the children, he was simply Mr. Daniel, the man who always carried extra storybooks and somehow lost every board game with remarkable consistency. Strangely, those ordinary moments had become the richest part of his life. A few weeks later, a national charity organization contacted Brooks Enterprises requesting permission to feature Claire House in a televised campaign celebrating community leadership. The producer enthusiastically suggested highlighting Daniel's financial success as the centerpiece of the story. Daniel smiled politely before shaking his head. "You are looking at the wrong person," he replied. "The building exists because one woman kept a promise every Wednesday for 3 years without asking anyone to notice. Tell that story instead." The documentary aired several months later. Claire appeared only briefly, exactly as she preferred, sitting cross-legged on a colorful rug reading another well-loved storybook, while children gathered around her with bright, expectant faces. Daniel appeared for only a few seconds in the background, arranging chairs before quietly walking away. Neither of them mentioned the donations, the sacrifices, or the building itself. They simply continued showing up. One evening after everyone had gone home, Daniel remained alone in his office. Expensive awards still lined one wall, reminders of decades spent chasing accomplishments that once seemed impossible. Yet his attention settled on something much smaller resting beside a framed family photograph. It was Sophie's handmade card, the one covered with colorful stars and uneven crayon letters that read, "Thank you for sharing Claire with us." Daniel smiled as he gently traced the faded words with his fingertips. Every business trophy in the room represented something he had earned. That simple piece of paper represented someone he had finally become. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the neighborhood rooftops, Daniel walked outside where Claire stood beneath the wooden sign beside Claire House, gently rocking Ethan while children waved goodbye across the parking lot. He slipped his hand into hers, and together they watched another peaceful Wednesday come to an end. Months earlier, he had followed his wife, believing he might uncover a secret capable of breaking his heart. Instead, he discovered that the greatest treasures are rarely hidden behind locked doors or guarded by wealth. Sometimes they quietly walk beside us every day, carrying an old canvas tote, keeping forgotten promises, and changing the world without ever asking to be seen.